On the Chinese Loans to Africa database, now updated to cover 2000 to 2023, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, or GDP Center for short. The GDP Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability around the world. My name is Rebecca Ray, Senior Academic Researcher at the GDP Center's Global China Initiative. A new update to the Chinese Loans to Africa, or CLA, database managed by the GDP Center provides insights and analysis on the state of Chinese lending to Africa in the lead-up to the 2024 summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC. Over the past 23 years, Chinese development finance institutions, commercial banks, government entities, companies, and other lenders have provided an estimated 1,306 loans, amounting to $182.3 billion to 49 African governments and 7 regional institutions. The year 2023 represents the first time the annual loan amount to Africa has risen since 2016. However, the increase most likely does not represent a return to consecutive years of annual commitment figures above $10 billion, as occurred in the early years of the Belt and Road Initiative. Instead, China appears to be looking for a more sustainable equilibrium level of lending and experimenting with a strategy comprising 3 basic components: new risk mitigation measures, fewer funds, and a focus on relationship management. While the maintenance of strategic relationships in Africa is key to China's long-term objectives, risk mitigation is necessitated by Africa's debt challenges and by China's domestic economic situation alike. China's lending to African countries in 2023 illustrates that new risk mitigation measures and the maintenance and strengthening of South-South cooperation may at times pull China in different directions. I'm pleased to be joined today by a panel of 3 of my colleagues, Lucas Engel, Zhizhong Huang, and Diego Morto. Lucas Engel is a data analyst for the Global China Initiative at the GDP Center and lead author of the new policy brief, Relative Risk and Rate of Return, Chinese Loans to Africa Database 2000 to 2023. Prior to taking up this role, Lucas interned with the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Zhizhong Huang is a Global China pre-doctoral research fellow at the GDP Center. She's also a PhD candidate in the Political Science Department at The Ohio State University, specializing in international relations, international development, and Chinese loans to Africa. Finally, Diego Morto is data analyst and database manager for the Global China Initiative and has worked across diverse fields, including management consulting, data analysis, and policy research. Now, before we open the discussion, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording is immediately accessible. Now, if you have questions, and we hope you do, please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu. When you do so, please also include your name and affiliation. We'll take questions after our initial discussion, but feel free to enter those questions at any time. There's no need to wait. Now, Lucas and Zhizhong will give an overview of their key findings and analysis, followed by a demonstration of the CLA database by Diego, and then we'll move into panelist and audience Q&A sessions. Lucas and Zhizhong, please take it away.
Thank you, Becky. All right, can everyone see our PowerPoint? Great. What's this? Great, thank you everyone for joining us today. So we will be talking about our most recent database release and our new data on Chinese loans to Africa today. We will first talk about trends in Chinese loans to Africa in the long term from 2000 to 2023, with a cumulative loan commitment of 182 billion. And then I will hand it over to Lucas to talk about the most recent year in 2023 and what has changed and what has remained, with a cumulative loan commitment of 4.6 billion for 2023. And this will be followed by database demonstration from Diego and a Q&A session. So from 2000 to 2023, cumulative loan commitment from Chinese financiers to African governments, their state-owned enterprises, and regional institutions reach a cumulative of 182 billion. And some of these loans are larger, as close to 1 billion or even more. Some of these loans are smaller, maybe 2 or 3 million, and they total 1,306 different loan commitments. These 49 recipients of Chinese loans include African governments themselves. So these might be the central banks of African governments or their state-owned enterprises that are majority African state-owned. So this is 51% or more. These loans may also went to 7 different regional institutions. These could be multilateral banks, such as the African Development Bank or the Afro-Exim Bank, or regional trade finance institutions. And next slide. And in terms of Chinese financiers, these include development finance institutions such as the China Development Bank or the Export-Import Bank of China, but they also include commercial lenders such as commercial banks in China. These include the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China with the Bank of China, and or they also include Chinese contractors who may offer suppliers credit to make their goods and services more competitive in Africa. However, as you can see here, the majority of Chinese loan commitments to Africa comprise of development finance institutions, and which represent 83% of overall finance to Africa. Okay, and I will hand it over to Lucas. And Lucas, let me know when you need me to switch slides.
Yes, of course. Thanks, John. So you might find that some of what I have to say is somewhat repetitive with Becky's very detailed and exhaustive introduction, which is great. I think it doesn't hurt to hit some of these main points. So for 2023, the CLA database records 13 new loans. We can switch here to the next slide, I think, with a combined value of 4.6 billion. That's about twice the amount committed in 2021 and 2022. And more importantly, it's the first time loan amounts have increased since 2016. Nevertheless, we don't expect a return to the early BRI years when annual commitments exceeded 10 billion every year. It's more likely that China is searching for a new and more modest equilibrium that takes Chinese domestic economic challenges, Africa's precarious debt situation, and China's long-term strategic objectives into account. To get somewhat more into the detail of some of these loans, we see a lender breakdown where all but one of the loans provided in 2023 came from Chinese DFIs, CDB and Checksum in particular. Borrowers include Egypt, Nigeria, Uganda, Angola, Madagascar, Eritrea, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and 2 regional institutions, the Africa Export-Import Bank, or Afrexim Bank, and the Africa Finance Corporation. With that, we would move on to the next slide, please. So, with that basic breakdown in mind, I'd like to delve into some of the things that stood out to us about China's lending behavior in 2023. We found it helpful to sort the behaviors we see in the 2023 data into 2 categories, change and continuity. I'll begin by highlighting some of the new behaviors or behaviors that stand out when compared to the last few years. First, we see here a unique sectoral breakdown in 2023 as compared to 2000 to 2022 data. In 2023, around half of all committed loans went to the financial sector. And looking back at our 2000 to 2022 data, we see only around 5.3% of loan commitments went to the financial sector. Most of the loans to the financial sector were for on-lending to SMEs and trade finance provided to regional and national banks, though we do have one loan to Egypt for liquidity support as well. That deserves mention. So the question we asked ourselves is, why would China choose to focus on these types of loans, specifically SME or small and medium-sized enterprise and trade finance on-lending loans? And our answer is risk mitigation. With that, I'd like to move on to the next slide. Great. So essentially, what we see is that China is outsourcing the quote unquote picking of winners to intermediaries with more knowledge of markets in Africa. Furthermore, the use of intermediary multilateral lenders in Africa also allows Chinese lenders to have an impact in those institutions' countries of operation without exposing Chinese lenders to risks associated with individual countries. Another related benefit, these on-lending facilities don't directly impact the debt burdens of individual sovereign borrowers. So the benefits I just listed are all related to risk mitigation, but how do Chinese commercial actors benefit? Well, it's difficult to say how exactly the 2023 SME and trade finance on-lending facilities will ultimately be spent. We know from past trade finance support facilities that they are intended to flow to companies that are engaged in China-Africa trade. In the case of SME on-lending facilities, there's evidence to suggest that recipients may be African-owned, but they may be Chinese-owned companies operating in Africa or Sino-African joint ventures. It's difficult to say how these on-lending facilities stack up in terms of benefits against the tied infrastructure loans, in terms of the benefits for commercial actors, but we can say that Chinese businesses do stand to gain from China's provision of these loans. Next slide, please. Another change we observed in the 2023 data, China's energy lending hiatus appears to be over. In 2021 and 2022, we saw no new loans to energy projects in Africa, and other GCI databases recorded no new energy lending worldwide during that time. This year, in Africa, we have 3 energy loans, 1 solar, 1 hydropower, and 1 transmission project with an unknown energy source. This is very much in line with the small is beautiful approach to lending. Our known energy types are solar and hydropower, and the scope of these projects is also comparatively modest. So when you look at the value of the hydropower project, for example, it's less than half the average in terms of cost, half the average of past Chinese financed hydropower projects in Africa. Next slide. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the lending behavior we would sort into the continuity category. So 3 of China's top 5 borrowers between 2000 and 2023 received loans in 2023. That may not sound unusual, but when we look at those borrowers' economic health and take into account China's hedging behavior that we discussed in the last section about change, China's decision to engage with these borrowers does throw up some questions. So Egypt, Nigeria, and Angola all received loans last year, and all 3 are facing strong economic headwinds. Egypt turned to the IMF in 2022 and experienced intense balance of payments issues in 2023. Nigeria is projected to slip to 4th place in the ranking of African economies as inflation and currency devaluation take their toll. And Angola recently asked China to use funds in repayment reserve accounts to repay debts and avoid debt restructuring. So given China's hedging behavior and new risk mitigation strategies, what would compel them to lend to these countries? Why not turn to more healthy borrowers in Africa? And we believe that this is all about China prioritizing existing relationships with strategic partners and reinvesting in these relationships despite the risks. Angola, Egypt, and Nigeria are all important when it comes to trade with China. Angola is Africa's largest exporter to China. Egypt and Nigeria are among the largest importers. Also, Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa. Egypt is the most populous country in the Middle East. In terms of global trade infrastructure, Egypt and Nigeria are also important to China. Chinese ships are the most frequent users of the Suez Canal, and China Harbor Engineering Company recently built and took a controlling stake in the Lekki port in Nigeria, one of the most important ports in West Africa. So with all of this in mind, I'd like to go to the next slide, please. One brief note on the size of China's reinvestment in strategic partnerships. The loan amounts that are being used to reinvest are comparatively modest when looking back at past commitments. The most glaring example here is Angola, where annual commitments averaged 2.8 billion between 2004 and 2018. Since 2018, we've recorded 1.2 billion in loans over 5 years. So it's fair to say that this is lending on a different scale. The exception this year seems to be a $973 million loan to Nigeria for the Kano-Kaduna rail project. That loan, however, is most likely an anomaly and an effort on China's part to bring a commitment made in 2006 to a conclusion. I don't believe that this project should provide any indication of the strategy China intends to pursue in future. With that, I think we can move to the next slide and the conclusion. So in summary, very brief summary, we see new experiments with risk mitigation strategies, but we also see a reinvestment in existing strategic relationships. We also expect individual commitment averages to drop as the pipeline of pre-pandemic big-ticket infrastructure items like the Kano-Kaduna railway empties out. It's also going to be interesting to see where the push and pull of new hedging strategies and risky lending to long-time ailing borrowers will take China. The 2023 data showed that risk mitigation and reinvestment in existing relationships may at times really be at odds and pull China in different directions. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch that push and pull going forward. And with that, I will close and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Zhizhong and Lucas, for that great introduction. I'll turn it over to Diego now, who'll give us a demonstration on the database itself.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Lucas and Zhizhong, for your presentation. I will now share with everybody the Chinese Loans to Africa database that I hope you can see. So maybe just a brief overview. I'm Diego Morrow. I'm the database manager here, and I manage the different databases associated with the Global China Initiative. We're really excited about the Chinese Loans to Africa database that we've officially launched last week. And as you already know, this is tracking loan commitments from China through Chinese development finance institutions, commercial banks, and other government entities and companies to sovereign recipients in Africa. And this is under PPG, so public and publicly guaranteed loans. And this enables us to be able to compare with World Bank types of loans. So we can jump right in by exploring the data here. If it obeys, there we go. So as you can see, we have our map of Africa, and the different bars on top of the different countries represent the lending amount by sector. And here below, you have the different sector breakdowns. So they're colored by sector. And if you click on or you hover over the different sectors, you're able to see through this tooltip the evolution of the lending for a particular sector, for instance, energy finance here. And likewise, for the year, you're also able to see, through this tooltip, the different sector breakdown in a given year. The map is dynamic, so when you click on the different countries, you're able to then see, it essentially applies a filter so that you're able to see the breakdown by sector as well as over time. Below, you can see the list of the different projects if you want more granularity. And don't forget, we have the regional loans as well. So if you click on the regional loans, you're able to see that breakdown for the loans that are going to the different recipients from a regional perspective, such as like the African Export-Import Bank and so on. Another option is to toggle between the sectors and the lenders if you want to see the different lenders involved. We break it down by these different categories: our development finance institutions, commercial banks, other Chinese financing, contractors, and other government institutions within China. And you're able to reset the map by clicking here. Finally, I want to take you to the About page where you can see further information and background about the Chinese Loans to Africa database. And you can cite it with this and visit the policy brief, which will go into more depth about the different trends that we highlighted earlier, thanks to Jijong and Lucas. And you're also able to download it by filling in this form here. So with that, that's the Chinese Loans to Africa Database Interactive, and I hope you enjoy using it.
Thank you to all three of my panelists. I'm going to start with a short Q&A session internally with our panelists, but I encourage all of our attendees to please feel free to drop a question of your own in the Q&A box that you'll see in your Zoom menu, which for most of us is at the bottom of your screen. And when you do so, please also include your name and affiliation so our panelists know who we're talking to. So as I kick off the discussion, I'll start with one targeted question for each of you. So I'll start with Diego. As the database manager of all of our database products here at the GDP Center Global China Initiative, I'd like to ask your kind of 40,000 feet view out of all the trends that were highlighted today for 2023 lending. What do you think the most important shift of 2023 has been in the loans provided by China to Africa? What really rises to the top for you as the top 2023 trend? And then I'll ask Lucas, let me ask all of my questions and I'll pass it to all three of you. For Lucas, I'll ask, should we expect a continued rise in annual loan amounts going forward? Is this a harbinger of continued growth? What can 2023 lending tell us about the trajectory of Chinese loans to Africa going forward? And then finally, I'll turn it to Jijong, who's recently come back from fieldwork last year in both Zambia and Cameroon. And Jijong, I'd like to ask you what insights that fieldwork may have given you in interpreting this data, the recent trends that have been highlighted by all of you. Thank you. So I'll turn it over to Diego first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Becky, for your question. So regarding the most, significant trends that I think we've observed, and sort of to reiterate what Lucas and Jijong highlighted earlier in their presentation, is really the focus on financial services and financial services emerging as the most the sector with the highest number of or highest loan amount received. And we believe that this partially suggests a risk mitigation strategy from China as it decides to want to sort of outsource the picking of winners, as Lucas earlier indicated. And we also think that at the same time, there is pressure to also being pulled in the other direction and continuing to support other lenders that might are having economic troubles, whether through debt or currency crises and so on, that you would not necessarily want to increase support for, but at the same time, in the name of South-South cooperation and the importance of maintaining certain relationships, China does continue to engage and re-engage with these partners. So I think those are the two broad trends that come to mind. And I'm not sure if there was another follow-up question, or was that it?
That's it for now. Thank you. Let's shift to Lucas and my question about what we might expect in future years.
Yeah, I think it would be a bit too optimistic to interpret the rise this year as a continued kind of trajectory upward. I'm a bit skeptical. I think at some point these loan commitments will even out at a lower kind of equilibrium than we saw in the early BRI years. What I do think is positive is that we'll see, I hope, a more diversified engagement with Africa that also experiments, that takes mistakes and sort of attempts to rebalance some of the past imbalances into account and sort of diversify engagement with Africa. I think that's what we're seeing here with the financial sector, lending and the on-lending for SME and trade finance. I think these go back directly to concerns about trade deficits, about perhaps a lack or a focus that could have been stronger on industrialization in Africa, and perhaps more experiments, more diversified engagement, but certainly not the big ticket infrastructure items that we saw in the past. I think it's also interesting to see the announcements that are coming out of the sort of prelude to FOCAC. We are seeing infrastructure there again, but it's important to read between the lines and see that this is not so much about lending. There's talk there about PPP. There's talk about different kinds of arrangements for pursuing infrastructure finance, and I don't think that lending for infrastructure is the way forward, and that is really what drove up those big loan amounts in the beginning. If we do see lending for infrastructure, it's going to be for very targeted strategic projects, and less of a spreading around of large amounts. Rather, I expect to see, like I said, experiments that address African concerns, and that hopefully address and lead to a more sustainable and resilient economic relationship between Africa and China.
Thank you, Lucas. And now on to Zhejiang for my question about your recent fieldwork and insight that it may have given you.
Thank you, Becky. So one of the 3 key points that I think are relevant for the database from my fieldwork is, first of all, the ability to absorb more loans differ greatly from state to state. Countries like Zambia have very little room to take on new additional loan financing since they are in sovereign default and have approached the IMF for a rescue package. While other countries like Cameroon, they can conceivably access more commercial rate loans, not concessional ones, commercial rate loans if they choose to, but they are also worried that they don't want to end up in the same position as Zambia, so they may not choose to borrow even if they could. So in other words, the number we have here are the result of a variety of different policy environment and selection criteria. Not all numbers are generated the same way. And second, infrastructure gaps in energy and transportation are still 2 sectors that African governments are eager to fill, given their importance for public support. However, both sectors are comparatively expensive to finance and risky for private sectors. So as Lucas said, this will be a challenge for African governments moving forward on where to find this money. Maybe private investment, maybe joint ventures. I can talk a little bit more about that later. And third, while public-private partnerships, or PPPs, this seems to be the theme of the moment, and it's been suggested for a range of infrastructure projects, I don't expect to see a host of new projects or players to pop up in PPPs. I expect to see the Chinese contractors who are involved in these PPPs are still the large SOEs we're used to seeing when these projects were loan financed. And the kind of projects that will be selected for PPP likely were large projects that were originally considered for loan finance. It's just that they can't be loan financed now, ergo they're going to PPP. So it's not going to be a wave, sea change of new projects and new players. It's the same players, the same projects doing things differently. And in terms of from my fieldwork, what I would expect to see at FOCAC will be emphasis on alternative financing and investment, in particular creating incentives for this private sector to take a stake in the project, which would allow less reliance on loan financing. So in general, contractors, Chinese would rather do engineering procurement and construction contracts or EPC contracts, meaning they're not on the hook for underperforming projects with low revenues after they have been completed, right? They would prefer to just do the project, take the money and leave, right? Thus, the Chinese government may signal some incentives for this private sector's willingness to jump in, such as offering sellers credit upstream for downstream investment or sino-shore coverage for suppliers credits, which are loan financing from contractors themselves. Right. So we may also expect to see discussions for more cooperation with regional financing institutions. As Lucas said, the Trade and Development Bank, the Afro-Exim Bank with AFD, and cooperating with the institutions would kind of spread out the risk a little bit, where China is not the only one on hook if there are defaults.
Thank you, Zhejiang. I'd like to actually, you mentioned FOCAC in your answer, and I'd like to open that up for the whole group. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is taking place as we speak this week in Beijing. And so I'd like to ask all three of you actually to look, coming out of this exercise of the project of updating this data and analyzing the trends, what insights does this give you for FOCAC? How does it shape your expectations? What recommendations or hopes might you be bringing to watching FOCAC? And what recommendation would you make to other FOCAC observers, folks who might be watching the proceedings of FOCAC from all over the world? What should we be watching for? And what might you hope comes out of it? What would your recommendations be? So I'd like to go in the same order as the previous round. So starting with Diego again, and then Lucas and Zhejiang, in case, I know you mentioned it already in your answer, but I want to give you a chance to come back to it proper once everyone else has had a chance to think about it. And as a reminder to all of our guests, please feel free to ask your own questions, because after this, I'll turn it over and read audience questions. So use that Q&A box in your Zoom menu. Thank you. Diego, over to you on FOCAC.
Yeah, so I haven't had as much exposure to FOCAC, unlike the others, but my first impression is that with the whole focus on wanting to lend more to financial sector providers and companies and sovereign institutions within that realm, and for risk mitigation strategies, I think that one of the main things is that it naturally shows that there is both the push and pull factor, right? So China is both focused on their own domestic economy and their domestic woes. I think some of the things that are happening, whether it's in the real estate sector or provincial debt, the provincial debt situation, and other economic concerns in the economy are obviously sort of making it more difficult to want to lend and subsidize certain projects in Africa and beyond. And I think that that's obviously going to continue. But at the same time, in FOCAC, you're going to see many different African countries want China to continue to lend and commit additional funds for things that they find strategic and necessary. So it will be very interesting to see how China is able to keep everybody happy and make sure that at the same time it's meeting the needs of the recipients, but at the same time that it knows how to channel the funds in a way that is most productive, right? And pursue more capital projects where they can focus capital on projects that are more are actually able to produce returns. And I think that that's going to be the hard part, just seeing China walk that tightrope.
Thanks, Diego. Your thoughts, Lucas?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this recently. My big question watching FOCAC is, what is the emphasis on infrastructure going to be. At first, it was, will there be any kind of focus on infrastructure? I know that during the last FOCAC, there was not one mention in Xi Jinping's keynote speech on infrastructure. Now we're already in the prelude, as I alluded to previously. We're already seeing infrastructure deals, and now for me the question is more about what is the financing mechanism behind this? Because as Jijong was explaining before, PPP, it's a new thing to Africa. It's new to Chinese companies who are used to EPC contracts where they build and they get out and they carry no risk, or at least very little risk compared to a PPP. So for me, I see the greatest likelihood of this infrastructure materializing with infrastructure lending. And I am not yet seeing lending pledges for infrastructure in a big way. And I also haven't yet heard anything about energy. This is still the very beginning of FOCAC, but this is certainly for those that are watching FOCAC, is when you hear about infrastructure is incredibly important to all of the China-Africa lofty goals that have been mentioned about industrialization, diversifying the relationship, making it more sustainable. Yes, this can be done through SME support and trade finance and all of the things that we saw in 2023. Those are great steps. But if you want to add value, if you want to support industrialization in areas like critical minerals, you need energy infrastructure, and I just don't see that materializing quickly under a PPP. So if we want to see a quick development in industrialization, a really effective partnership between China and Africa on industrialization, I think we need to see lending for energy and transport, personally. Yeah, I would
Thanks,
leave it at that.
Lucas. And Zhizhong, back to you.
Thank you. I think the one more thing I wanted to add would be, I think China will put on during this upcoming FOCAC, we'll see a lot more emphasis on green energy transition. There are, with the new demand for green energy, especially batteries, right, EV batteries, African states with lithium deposits or other critical mineral deposits, they are crucial for every large industrial countries outside. So it's not just China is interested, US is interested, Europe is interested. So China has to bring forward something that they can uniquely offer that other countries are less advantaged. For example, I would expect to see offers of upgrading, profit sharing, upgrading, such as instead of raw mineral exports, China might offer things like refining or even battery production, even assembly. So these might be the things that I would hope to see, and I would expect to be at least touched on during FOCAC.
Great. Thank you all so much for your answers to that, your thoughtful analysis of what we might expect to see in the coming days. I'll turn it over now to the questions that are coming in that Q&A box. So again, as a reminder to everyone, feel free to add your questions there as well. We have 2 questions so far. The first is from Dan Murphy, who asks, do you have any insights as to why it is that Angola, Egypt, and Nigeria are the strategic relationships that China's doubling down on, even given their risks associated with their debt levels? Why these 3 countries in particular? I know Lucas mentioned briefly that area of analysis, but I'd love to give you more time to really get into that than a PowerPoint allows you to. And then another question from Frank, excuse me for mispronouncing your last name, Kellenbach, from the European International Contractors, who's asked a question about to what extent are these loans tied to the use of Chinese contractors? In other words, can non-Chinese companies benefit from some of these rather big loan amounts? I'll give both of these questions to the panelists for whoever's most inspired to start first on those. Everyone doesn't need to feel pressure to answer that, but perhaps, if I may, Lucas, how would you feel about starting with that first question about Africa, Egypt, and Angola? I'm sorry, Nigeria, Egypt, and Angola. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that investigation deserves more depth. I think one thing we often think about is new loan commitments. We far less often we talk about ongoing disbursements and the long time horizon of these loans. So in Angola, which borrowed far larger amounts in the mid 2000s, reaching up into the mid 2010s. Those loans are now in repayment. Those loans are partly also still being dispersed. So talking about relationships in terms of lending, it's somewhat reductive to speak about it in terms of only new commitments. So there is still Chinese money going into these countries based on contracts that were signed a long time ago, and there's still money flowing from Angola to China based on commitments that were made a long time ago. So I talked about trade. Of course, yes, we can talk about Angola's importance as an exporter of oil. I mentioned that in the PowerPoint, but I think when we talk about maintaining relationships and staying on a positive footing, I think it's also important to mention financial ties that we don't see reflected in new commitments necessarily. And of course, also, I'm just going to very briefly touch on this, but competition. It's difficult to completely isolate this from the discussion. Of course, there are these efforts by the United States in the libido corridor and whatnot. And so certainly China would also be inspired to want to provide an answer to some of those initiatives as well. Although I don't feel confident speaking at length on those things, but in summary, yes, what I mentioned in the PowerPoint, trade, then again, ongoing commitments, and also perhaps aspects of competition.
Thanks, Lucas. Do any of our other panelists want to touch base on the importance of those three countries? Zhizhong, any insights, or shall we move on to the next question?
I think if I have to be like very coarse about why these countries, I think Angola, there's no secret that it's the oil. But I want to emphasize that China does not depend on Angola for oil. It's Angola depend on China as an export market. Angola is not even the primary source of oil for China. China is more eager to diversify where they get their oil from. It's Angola that is tied to China, selling almost, I think, 98% of all of their crude oil to China. So, and also China is holding up Angola as a model. I don't know if they still do that these days. In the past, the Angola model, which is what it was called, was Chinese government to offer loans in exchange for oil payment and using these loans to build infrastructure. Angola just came out of civil war in the early 2000s, and they needed a lot of infrastructure. And it worked out so far, not terribly. It's not ideal. They're still heavily in debt, but at least in the mid 2000s and 2010s, it was held up as an example of South-South cooperation. And China is not about to let Angola sink. It would look very bad for China. And for Nigeria, we have to keep in mind it is the largest market in Africa. So even if they don't have oil, which they do have a lot of, I think Nigeria is, for economic and financial reasons, a good place to invest in. And finally, Egypt, we have to keep in mind the Suez Canal. China has a lot of stake in making sure everything is peachy with the Suez Canal for export reasons. Okay, I'll leave to Becky, and we'll touch on the next question, and I'll
Yes, let's move on to the next question. This one should be relatively quick and easy to answer, which is the question about whether any of these loans are untied. Are any of these loans the kind of projects that non-Chinese contractors could bid on? Or are these, as is the case with many export credit agency loans around the world, tied to the use of exporting the services of infrastructure contractors from a particular nationality? Thanks.
Yeah, so I guess my initial impression, and feel free the rest of you to jump in, is that we would have to look at the 13 different loans to see, who are the different contractors involved. I think most of the projects already have designated contractors. For example, in the case of the Lagos Kano Railway, the Kaduna Kano section, we know that it's the China Railway Construction Company that is behind that. So I think we should look into more detail to see the different potential opportunities there. I do want to say that for the regional loans, for instance, the one to the Africa Finance Corporation, it's not explicitly tied to certain contractors, because the on-lending that occurs is we do not know about it. We do not know the exact destination, right, or recipient. So I think that what we do know is that it's to boost trade and finance in Africa, which could be intra Africa or with China. So I think for the intra-Africa trade, that perhaps there are opportunities for other contractors to get involved. And I don't, yeah, it's not explicit in that way, but I think that it would warrant further investigation to see specific projects where they could welcome, foreign contractors and so forth.
Thank you. I'll take it back to the Q&A box now for a few new questions that have arisen. Excuse the noise in the background. My first question is, what's the likelihood that bilateral trade between China and Africa will see an increased use of the yuan or the renminbi? Now, I'll take the moderator's privilege of answering this question to say that the GDP Center does extensive work on the use of bilateral currency swaps. This is a crucial aspect of the financial safety net, the global financial safety net. It's out of the purview of sovereign finance because it does not add to debt. It is not used for development projects. It's used for financial stability, more akin to what the IMF does than to what the World Bank does. For example, if we're looking for Bretton Woods analogs. And for this, I'll ask if our comms team can drop a link to, thank you, and a link is being dropped in the chat right now to explore our work on the importance of the global financial safety net and the implications for financial stability and trade of these bilateral currency swaps, including the potential expansion of the use of the renminbi in global trade. But getting back to this data set in particular, I want to end by asking each of you to reflect briefly on the implications of these for the big questions that our center is organized around, which is financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability. We have a question in the Q&A box asking, how does working with African regional institutions affect those big three questions? How does that help or hinder the social and environmental governance of loans by sending it through African institutions for African governance of these loans? And if there's time, I'd also love to hear, does the drying up of lending for infrastructure, how does that affect Africa's long-term sustainable and inclusive economic development goals? If the Nigerian railway, which is being financed in sections, if no more sections are financed, what implications does that have for Nigeria's ability to continue to diversify and grow? Are they able to find sources of investment, PPPs, either within China or from other countries? Or are these mandates simply going completely neglected now? Because as Lucas said, we probably won't see large-scale lending for infrastructure in the same way from China. But as Zhizhong said, this is a sector that's very risky for private sector investors who would much rather simply pursue EPC contracts or turnkey contracts, where they can literally turn the key and walk away when it's done, rather than take on project performance risk. So what does this do to the development prospects for the countries that previously had been borrowing for infrastructure to hopefully develop economically? Thank you. Who would like to take one of those first?
Okay, I can give the infrastructure one a shot. So I think the infrastructure gap is definitely still there if you look at infrastructure coverage in both cellular, electricity, and roads. There's still a long way to go, and I don't think African government's just going to let it fall by the wayside just because they can't find loans specifically for it. They would just have to find alternative ways of financing. So for example, some sectors are more amenable to public-private partnerships, such as independent power producers. So these are small solar power plants or small wind farms that could be hooked up to the national grid. Then if there is a guarantee that the government would purchase the electricity at a reasonable price, the private sector would be interested in entering. However, there are some projects such as rural feeder roads. These are roads that cannot be tolled. There's no money to be made. This is a service provided. So it's impossible to get private money interested in building a rural road to a village of 30 people. However, this is not to say that these projects can never be financed. I think we mentioned before that if we see loans in the future, they will be probably much more targeted on areas that are difficult for loan financing, right? So I would in fact expect to see these rural feeder roads are especially the candidates for loan financing. They're not as expensive, but they are critical for population's well-being, right? And since there are no money to be made about it, you cannot get private investment in it. So it's the big projects such as major highways that can be tolled might get public-private partnerships, or large power plants that has a power purchasing agreements that might get private financing. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Yes, thanks. Anybody else want to contribute to those questions, perhaps on the impact of using intermediary financial institutions? That question was posed in the Q&A box by GDP Center postdoctoral research associate Bowen Gu. What are the implications of crowding in African governance on environmental and social impacts of projects by sending that financing through intermediaries, specifically regional intergovernmental bodies? Any thoughts on that?
Well, first, I actually wanted to weigh in on something that Zhizhong said, or offer a little augment. One thing I also think could be interesting is China piggybacking off of other countries' efforts to step up their support for infrastructure. This is also a possibility. There are now other players in that game, although I think it still remains to be seen whether they are committed and how committed they are, and how quickly those funds can really turn into projects. But perhaps if China plays its cards right, it can sort of outsource the infrastructure to others and focus on industrialization. I think they would be very lucky if they could do that. Just a thought I'd like to put out there. And also just a very short thought on Bowen's question there. I think it's empowering, isn't it? It's to give a lot of this decision making to African intermediary organizations. I know that they are constrained by the agreements that they have with the Chinese lender providing the on-lending facilities. So the contract that the Chinese lender has with the African financial institution would set out certain guidelines for where that money can go. But of course, the Chinese institution's ultimate objective is to again piggyback off the expertise of the African institution. I think there's potential here for ESG benefits, but to me, what I see is a great benefit in ownership, which is of course a big topic, always in development, and something that I think is very positive, and also shows a learning process on the Chinese side, I think.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts with us today, and to everyone who joined in our discussion. This talk has been recorded on YouTube, and we'll share that link in the chat. To receive updates for these events and other publications, you can subscribe to receive updates from our Global China Initiative, and that link will also be in the chat for you to use. Thank you again, and see you next time.